This class will be concerned with Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory. Gert Hofstede introduced his model on cultural dimensions around the 1970s. The model implies that different countries have different cultures, which impacts on the way in which they operate in organizations. So the wider cultural aspects of the country, the wider cultural dimensions of the country, impact on the way in which business is organized and the way it performs. In other words, businesses are not cocooned from the society. They're not cut off from the society. They are a part of the society, and to a large extent they reflect the society. There's no single management style or theory that can be applied universally. So it's important to recognize that organizations operate in cultural environments. Those environments vary from country to country and right around the globe, and therefore it's not realistic to look for a single management theory or an explanation of management style that applies universally. Clearly, organizations will be different depending on their cultural environment, depending on their history, on their development, on the politics of the country, the social structure of the country, and so on. So looking for a single management theory is not very realistic. His pioneering research provides an insight into different cultures. He carried out his research on employees working for IBM in over 50 countries. And from the research, he identified 6 cultural dimensions of difference or value perspectives between national cultures. So what Hofstede did was he managed to explain cultural dimensions in terms of differences between one culture and the next, and then he was able to classify these differences under 6 headings. These are the 6 cultural dimensions of difference or value perspectives. So we're now able to group countries and group places on the earth under these 6 different headings, and we can see similarities between different cultures according to their groupings. We can also see differences according to their groupings. Now, the cultural dimensions, well, there's a power distance index, which is high to low. It's an index. So there's a power difference, and we'll explain what this means in a moment. Individualism versus collectivism, again explained shortly. Masculinity versus femininity. Uncertainty avoidance index. Now that index ranges from high to low again, and again we'll talk about it later. The pragmatic versus normative. And finally, indulgence versus restraint. So we have 6 headings, and we'll look at what's meant by each one of these and then start to try to classify countries, and not based on explicitly on his research, but obviously leading from his research, and the charts that we'll use are based on his research, but we can see ourselves from what we know of different parts of the world that they do generally fit under these headings. We'll see how it works as we go through. Let's start with the power distance index. Now, based on inequality and power distribution within a country and what is considered as normal within the society. So it's looking at the distribution of power within a country. Who is powerful, who is not powerful, and what is normal within that society. What's considered to be normal in terms of power. So that's the basis for the index. Different countries accept different levels of power amongst the population. For example, social class status. And it's almost fair to say that every country has got a power distance index which is positive. It's positive in the sense that it is capable of measurement. It's not zero. If we consider the United Kingdom, we have social class. In America, there are some people who are very powerful in America and who are perhaps very rich, others who are very poor. And there is a power distance index that can pick this up. So within countries we can see it. We can also certainly see it between countries. Some countries are rich and perhaps more egalitarian, perhaps more equal, and have measures, political measures in place trying to balance out power within the country, perhaps through the taxation system or through the legal framework. But other countries may lag behind in this, so there will be certainly quite big differences in the comparisons between countries. Now, lower power distance index implies power is more equally distributed within society. A high power distance index suggests high degrees of relevance on power and inequality as the norm. So if the index is high, there is more inequality. Index is low, less inequality. So let's look ahead. The power distance index. Now the attributes, well, high. Centralized organization with centralized control and power. So this could be the government taking a big role in the society, or it could be organizations, it could even be commercial organizations who are very powerful by virtue of their size and their importance within the country. Complex hierarchy with clear authoritarian leadership style. So perhaps the whole organization is headed by one person. That one person is seen as very important. A low power distance index, well, tends to be flat organizations. In other words, all departments perhaps within the organization are seen as equally important. There's more delegation, more trust in the workforce to do the job, respect and trust amongst the employees. The employees are treated equally, they're treated fairly and equally. Decision-making control entrusted to employees. And that could also be written in terms of the society in general, where there is more trust in the population, that the population understand what perhaps the government's doing and are on the government's side, and they don't have to be coerced. So this is what we mean by power distance index. And we've got the attributes here on this particular slide. If we look at the world map of this, as suggested by Hofstede, we'd have a situation like this, where a large index or a high index would be the dark green, and a small index or very little would be white. Some very poor countries may have a very small index simply because they don't have the organizational structure or the resources to put an organizational structure in place. But if we look at America here, it would be much lighter in color than, say, the Russia, the Russian Federation, many other countries. So we'd expect the Russian Federation to be much more controlling, much more interventionist, whereas the American and Canadian and Australian, the British, Irish, Northern Europeans, they're much more trusting of the population. Now, individualism versus collectivism, the extent to which there is group integration within society and organizations. This is a measure of the degree to which groups integrate. The dimension looks at the level of commitment and ties within communities. For example, does a society expect to belong to a larger group and expect to be cared for by each other? It's our concept of community. Do the people within the community look after each other? And it's the degree to which this happens. If they don't, then they're more individualistic. They look after themselves. If they tend to look after each other and watch out for each other and help each other, they tend to be more collective. Individualism in society tends to look after themselves and their own goals. Collectivist societies look after everyone and work together to achieve goals. So in a collectivist society, the government may give the lead and get everyone to work for certain objectives and to develop in certain ways. Whereas individualism suggests that we each look after ourselves. We try to develop ourselves, and we're not too caring about the rest of society. It's the individual that matters. So there is a big distinction between individualism and collectivism. Now, the attributes, well, a high individualism versus collectivism index, well, for a high one, there's a need for privacy, freedom, and individual rewards for achievements. Individuals are concerned about themselves and their needs. That's a lot of individualism there. So it's a high index. They look after themselves, they develop themselves, and they're not particularly that interested in what's happening to their fellow man within that society. They're looking after themselves. A low index, well, importance is placed on maintaining harmony. Individuals work to achieve intrinsic rewards rather than extrinsic, and need for recognition. What we mean by that is that with a very low index, they're much more collective, and the individuals are working towards helping themselves but also helping others. And their rewards are this internal feeling that they have made a contribution and they are helping their fellow man. If we look at the map here, collectivist versus individualist, we see that the places like America, Australia, the Europeans tend to be the darker colour. So there's they're more individualistic. We are more interested in the markets ourselves, developing ourselves, and the belief is that if we do this, we're going to develop the whole society. If everyone looks after themselves, then society in total will be better. Whereas with the collectivist view, everyone needs to be pulled along and helped. So people don't just work for themselves, they work for their fellow man as well, and they support their fellow man through the taxation system or through some sort of additional contributions. Now, masculinity versus femininity. Well, this dimension refers to the distribution of roles men and women adopt in society. Masculine cultures are conducive to dominating, assertiveness, power and materialism, which makes the male of the species look very bad indeed, because males tend to be more dominating, more aggressive, more assertive, more interested in power, more interested in materialism. So the males conduct themselves in this manner, according to this view. Females, the feminine culture, by way of contrast, are more interested in relationships and in the quality of life, in feelings and in emotions. So we have a contrast here in terms of the orientation of the two sets, masculine going one way, feminine going a different route. Now, for a high index here, well, significance placed on the ego, pride, power, money, status. This is the masculinity index. This is high masculinity. Men are seen to be assertive, strong, and there's a wider gender gap. They see themselves as almost hunter-gatherers. They're the ones who are going to save the world. So they're much more interested in their own ego, their pride, power, money, status. For a low index, importance given to lifestyle, the quality of life, good relationships, better working ethic, and work cohesion. More overlap between genders and roles, better gender equality. So female employees are promoted and become managers and directors and may become the CEO of the company, but have the opportunity to do so. They're not artificially stopped. There's no prejudice in the system that stops them from achieving that. So high masculinity, much more interested in the ego, in themselves, pride, power, money, status, as written here. And for more feminine type of society, more interested in the quality of life, more interested in the work ethic. There has been some blurring of this distinction in many societies, where men start to realize that the quality of life is important, and where we should look after the environment, we should look after community, and we should have respect for whatever, for the way in which we live and the ways of lives of others, and so on. And also, females are entering the workplace and achieving significant positions. So there is a blurring to some extent of the difference. Nonetheless, according to Hofstede, this is the index, and this is what we should look for. And if you look at the world map here, then we have a lot of masculinity in some countries. The map, the darker the color, the more masculine the type of society is. The lighter the color, the less masculine the society is. In other words, it may be a fairer society or even a better society as measured from the two ends of the spectrum, the male side and the female side. So that's the findings on that one. Now next, uncertainty avoidance index. This dimension refers to the extent societies prefer structure to unstructured, and how well they cope under anxiety and unpredictable situations. We try to avoid uncertainty. A lot of people in the world are fearful about the uncertain. It depends on their particular makeup, whether they're pessimistic or optimistic, or what their particular psychological stance is. But this dimension refers to the extent that societies prefer structure to unstructured. We like a structure. unstructured sounds chaotic, and we don't want to be in that position. High uncertainty avoidance cultures aim to make life very predictable and controlled. So if we have a lot of fear of uncertainty, we try to avoid it. We can factor this into the way in which we live, and that shows up in the type of society we've got. We try to minimize uncertainty. They are less tolerant to change, therefore implement strict laws, policies and regulations. And some societies don't want change. They're fearful of change, and they're fearful of letting the population have the access to change. Some parts of the world may not agree with the use of, let's say, the internet, or the widespread use of the internet, because it may give the population ideas or wants or ways of living which is contrary to their more traditional way of going about life. So in some parts, technology may not be widely accessible. The whole idea is to try and keep the status quo. Try to keep the society moving the way it has always moved. To stop new ideas. To stop change, because change is uncertain. Low uncertainty avoidance cultures are more relaxed and open to changing circumstances. So, if the society welcomes new technology and welcomes contacts with other countries, and one organization embraces wider training and allows its workforce to get new ideas and helps them to develop themselves, it's helping the organization, it's helping the society as well. That type of society is more open. They're more tolerant towards change. Now the attributes, well, high uncertainty avoidance index is rigid and structures organizations and society. More importance placed on rules. Preference to be in control, tend to be more reserved. So these ideas are associated with trying to avoid uncertainty. So the structures become very rigid to avoid the possibility of newness, of innovations, of change. Keep the structures as they are, so that the owners can keep control, so that the government can keep control, and have rules in place to stop anything which can lead to uncertainty. Of course, these societies tend to stagnate over time and fall behind others, and eventually many of them collapse, and then they tend to integrate with more advanced societies, ones who have been allowed to develop. But there is a cultural issue about uncertainty and trying to avoid it, that may be based in religion, it may be based in the society itself, in the schooling system, the education system, it may be based on the culture, which places a lot of emphasis on the old ways of working, the old ways of living, and these were seen as somehow superior. For a low uncertainty avoidance index, well, that's open to change, open to innovation and new ideas, able to adapt to changing circumstances. And in the world in which we live today, one typified by globalization and global trade and commerce and communication systems, this is the way we live. We need to keep up with innovations and new ideas. The map suggested by Hofstede looks something like this. Tolerance are the lighter colours, and the more controlling would be the darker colours. There are some surprises on the map. For example, France and Spain tend to be much more trying to avoid uncertainty according to this view, whereas the United Kingdom and Ireland and I think Mongolia and a few parts of Africa and a couple of countries in South America tend to be more tolerant, the most tolerant. America has got rules and regulations, but we know America to be highly technological and advancing ideas and open to change. Just maybe some parts that are resistant to change, which perhaps gives the index a slightly darker colour. Long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. This dimension looks into the value of time, religiosity and nationalism. Religiosity is one which we don't normally consider in these situations, but when we look at parts of the index, the Hofstede index, or the indices, and the whole thrust of this analysis, we have to bear in mind the wider cultural issues, including religion, including history, including this very strong cultural traditions and norms that some societies hold. So this particular dimension, as I said, looks into the value of time, religion and nationalism, the cultural tradition of the country and the way they see the country. They see themselves as a particular national entity, and they want to perhaps keep it like that. Short-term oriented cultures are more focused on the past and present, placing greater emphasis on traditions and religion. So we have a distinction here. We've got just for those 2 points, we can see that in the long term there's this emphasis on religiosity and nationalism and time, looking at trying to keep the organization or the country, whatever it is we're talking about, but the organization or the country, trying to keep that as it is, trying to look at it in that way. The short term, more focused on the past and present, placing greater emphasis on traditions and religion. The short term is absolutely trying to fix the organization and hold it in place. The long term, hold it in place, but allow it to mutate, allow it to change slightly over time. So there is a change element in point 1. There's no change element in point 2. In the short term, it's fixed, it's locked together. Long-term oriented cultures see a linear approach, driven by the future expectations, goal-oriented and value rewards. So in the long term, there's a recognition that the society will change, but in the short term it's fixed. We don't see changes in the society on a day-to-day basis. We have to look over longer periods to see changes. Now the index, or the separation here, high index would be long-term future perspectives, emphasis placed on education and goal-orientated. The lower one focus on religion and traditions Values and rights are strongly emphasized within the organization or within the country, whichever one we're looking at. Strong enhancement and need to please parents. More time taken to build and maintain good relationships. So we have a split. Long term, more emphasis placed on education and trying to achieve goals. The society, it's recognized, will mutate over time, will change over time. Organizations, companies will change over time. The way they're organized and structured, the type of technology they use, the way the labor force is deployed within the organization, the opportunities for the labor force to progress within the organization. All of these may change over a long period, but in the short period they tend to be fixed. So if you look at the society in terms of short term, which is termed here as monumentalism, and long term orientation, Flexhumility. Looking at this world map, we see that some tend to be short term. For example, the Russian Federation, I should say, and China. So they have long-term emphasis. They tend to lock themselves in for the long term, whereas short term would be more European, large parts of Africa, and America and Canada are more short term than long, but they're on further along the index. So we can see different parts of the world have different emphasis on different parts of the index. Now, indulgence versus restraint. Well, this dimension is concerned with society's openness to personal needs and desires. Societies with high indulgence versus restraint index encourages individuals to be expressive about their desires, sexuality, emotions, and to enjoy life. So this would be much more indulgent, the higher index. Societies with a low index are very restricted and oppressive, with strict rules and punishment for not following the norms. So the government lays down the rules, and the society must follow those rules. Those rules are probably grounded in history, in tradition, in culture. But when the rest of the world is changing, some societies find it very difficult to adhere to those norms. But the same happens within companies. Companies that are very open, very indulgent, will try to train their workforce, give them opportunities, will be more flexible, whereas the ones in restraint will be much more controlling about the workforce, much more monitoring and interventionist, and so we see it within organizations as well as within society. Organizations, to some extent, it could be argued, are microcosms of the society. So a high index, freedom of speech, this is the more indulgent one, freedom of speech, employee rights, welfare protected, equal opportunities and diversity. Low ones will be employment contracts and rights may not be given much importance, so the employment contract is broadly ignored. The company may not give a lot of rights or freedoms to the workforce. They may be abused and harassed, in fact, and there may be stricter laws in place to restraint or restrict individuals. So again, we have an index for this, and that's the way Hofstede sees the world, with the more indulgent as the darker reds, and the lighter reds, or down to the pinks, being a mixture and going all the way across to the grey ones, which are in restraint, trying to control the workforce, trying to stick to traditional methods, but trying to control through the use of laws and rules and regulations the way the workforce conduct themselves. So that's Hofstede, and those are the various indices that Hofstede derived from his research in the 50 countries, the IBM companies in 50 countries. It's a way in which we can look at cultural differences and try to work out what type of organization we're dealing with. So if we see a particular company, it would be worth making a note of these various indices and trying to classify the company under the index, just by simply reading about it, reading a case study perhaps, and trying to work out if the company is more masculine or feminine or more indulgent, or what is it? What type of company is it? What's it trying to do? And that in turn will give us an insight into the way the company is structured, and the likely future of the company, if it embraces new ideas, and if it is one which will survive in an ever-changing environment. But as I said, that's all we need to do here, so let's leave it at that. Those are the sources that were consulted, and let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.